welcome to Holochain Chats. Today, we're doing a fun interview with Adam Bumpus. Am I saying your name correctly, Adam?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So it's Dr. Adam Bumpus, and you are a climate change solution expert. That's exciting, with nearly 20 years of experience in climate tech and carbon finance. So interesting background. I did not know this about you. We've met a couple of times and been working on different things together, but you have a doctorate from Oxford University, and that I didn't know that you've worked in the carbon markets and sustainable development for 20 years. This is amazing.
Yeah.
I, of course, know that you're the co-founder of the Internet of Energy Network, ION, which is awesome, and related to Holochain, which is very cool. I would love to talk to you today about how you're advancing all of the energy solutions and how you're understanding this space, this network. There's so many details in this that people don't know about. So I'm hoping we can dig in and kind of make it really more human. Cool. People who listen to these sorts of things kind of have that way to kind of grab onto something and understand it and make it meaningful for themselves. So I'm sure I missed a whole bunch of things about your background that are really interesting. So why don't you start with telling us your version of who you are, and maybe a little bit of what you really want to dive into today and talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Look, I think the thing that sits for me when I really think about who I am or what I'm doing this, and sometimes when someone says, you've been doing this for 20 years, I feel terrible because we're still in such a terrible state for the climate and what we're doing. It's like, wow, 20 years has gone by. And it's true. And I started off as an ecologist. So as a kid, I loved being in the countryside and that kind of stuff, but I actually wrote my undergrad in ecology, and that is a blessing and a curse at the same time. This was back in the late 90s, because you learn about this incredible world that we've got and the way that biological and different environmental ecosystems work together, and you start to see the interconnections between everything. But you also see what state we're in at that kind of fundamental systemic level. And, doing biodiversity and doing climate work and looking at how, even just as an undergraduate, how really, challenged we are in this area. This was like 5 years after the Rio Earth Summit. And so it was on the agenda, but it wasn't really taking precedent. But then you fast forward like another 25, 30 years essentially, and we're in this space now where we're still trying to figure out how to solve the problem, but we've got so many more tools and so much better understanding and much more awareness of it. So for me, it's still in my heart as an ecologist. It really is. And even though it's been business and a bunch of different stuff on the route to get to where we are talking today, the fundamental part is I believe everything is interconnected, and if we are to create solutions here, we've got to find that interconnection and common ground to make things happen. So that's why.
Absolutely.
We'll dive into it. We'll get into that.
Oh, great.
And I'd love to hear about. I'd love to dive into. We're talking about commodities and energy and environmental commodities. I'd love to dive into what does that look like in specific places and how we actually create things that create real long-term value. And that's the stuff I love.
Well, that's what I'd like to do is try to kind of have us first. What are some of the problems? What are some of the challenges that we're dealing with in terms of making shifts that it seems like a lot of people know are necessary to make, and that, and at one level we've begun to make them. I mean, I don't want to discount how much there has been innovation and there has been transformation in the energy sector. There really has. But like you're saying, it's not sufficient. So what are those things that are blocking it from being sufficient?
Yeah. There's been massive strides. We are, emissions are still growing, but we are likely to hit that global point within this year or next year where we do tip it. And it is that kind of peak. And so then we start to pull them down, so one of the biggest things here is the challenge has been the enormity of the problem, and that for so long, fossil fuels just made so much sense, and we can't deny that. For a really long time, we had no idea. We've known about climate change since the late 1800s, but in terms of the veracity of it and what we're doing from fossil fuels, we didn't really know for a long time. Now we have known for 40 years now, but that it's just the lifeblood of the economy of the world. And so the biggest first part of it was just the scale of that change. The second part of it is and I'm talking about the technical stuff, I'm talking about the human bit in a second, it's just the economics. Like we didn't have the technologies at the economies of scale that we could deploy fast enough to make that happen. And then, of course, the price of solar has come down, the price of wind has come down. Those kind of big installations that you can put around the world are now on parity and in many places better economics than fossil fuels. And so all of that now makes tons of sense to put in. The barriers come when we have either hard places to get rid of those emissions, so big industry and some others that they're still burning tons of fossil fuels to do the work that they do, which is to create products that everyone wants. And that's the challenge, that there's this kind of systemic part around, okay, we can we, there's a question, can we consume our way out of climate change? The answer is probably not, because we have to drive changes now, or we have to consume differently. And then the next part of that is, who is missing out during this transition? And the energy transition it's basically happening in Europe. It's happening in North America. It's not happening in Africa so far. It's not really happening in Asia so far, even though China is an incredible example of huge gigawatts of renewable energy going in, but there's also huge gigawatts of fossil going in as well, because these countries have not got to the level of riches and 2-3 cars per household that we see in Europe and the US that have been bought by burning fossil fuels. So there's this kind of really difficult challenge here that's saying, well, how do we address those really hard to abate sectors, and how do we address the places on Earth that need that if we are to solve the climate issue, need to stop burning fossil fuels, but have every right per capita to burn those fossil fuels? And so that's kind of where I think the opportunity comes in terms of, in a distributed world, in the Web3 world. It's like, well, it is built for decentralization and distribution, and that is what the new energy system actually will be based on, is this distributed assets. And so I think there's the blockers there are those technical ones, the economic ones, and then the kind of uneven development associated with clean energy. And then there's this human psychology part of it, is that it's just hard to give up stuff that we like, and it's hard to give up life as we know it, in that sense of, look, the electricity comes in, we're burning electricity, I don't really know where it comes from, I don't really care. That's kind of like, because people just want the light, they want the electricity. There's this kind of understanding, and it is changing, but it's like, how do we get to that point where we're comfortable with the really bumpy ride that's coming? And or we accept that we're going to feel uncomfortable for a little bit. Prices will spike, prices will be difficult, power cuts will come. This is all going to be part of this transition, and we'll have less of that if we manage it well. And so I think there's that part that at the end is like, it's education and understanding. Are we okay in ourselves to do this?
Right. Well, I want to start with a couple of definitions, because I want to know from, as we kind of delve into some of the specifics that I think you can make real for us. I want to understand first, are we talking about the electricity market? Are we talking about all energy? Let's start with that one just for me, so that I can understand how to kind of contain this, because I know they're related.
Yeah, great question. So energy, everything is energy, which is super cool. And the whole universe is energy. We have all the energy that's ever been or ever will be created. It just exists. It is, which is just one of the coolest things in the entire world. I've got little kids, so we're trying to read about space and what it looks like and things. So whenever they just want to tell me to shut up, but it's really fascinating, all that stuff. So really what we're talking about, and what we're talking about at the Internet of Energy Network, is at the moment electricity, which has got some, so let's talk about electricity. The most, in order to deal with climate change, we have to basically electrify everything.
Right.
So every time you see a gas burning car, or a fossil fuel burning car, oil car, or you see like a natural gas, or you see anything being burnt as a fossil fuel, that's got to be electrified. And that is a massive challenge. And so the reason it's got to be electrified is because we can generate electricity from renewable sources. That's it. And so, and electricity is, from a development point of view, for people, like when the power goes out in our houses in the developed world, people lose their minds. For the first hour, they're like, oh, isn't this quaint? We can have candles. It's so romantic. And then hour 2, hour 3 comes past. We're like, what the hell? Where's my internet? And it's like, it's this, when the power's gone, it's people lose their minds. Yet for vast majority of the world. In fact, there's more people without access to electricity in 2021 than there was in 2019, because we've got population growth and the infrastructure is not keeping up with it. And so for people who are suffering either no electricity or very bad, shoddy electricity in terms of sometimes on, sometimes off, you can't make any decisions. You can't grow economies. You can't invest. All that stuff relies on electricity. And so the electrification is the key bit here.
Yeah.
And it is,
I hear
it's
that.
so uneven.
And that's really important. I think people miss this, right? And this is why I brought this question up, because so much of the time we're looking only at the electricity market. We're looking at how are we moving to sources that are more planet friendly, essentially, regenerative. But we have to include moving things to that and than having the electricity sourced in those ways. It's a multiple stage problem. And I think to your point at the beginning, when you talk about, energy and how do we solve global warming, or how do we solve the climate crisis, whatever words people want to put to it today, it is huge. But chunking it down into, okay, we have this initiative and we have this other initiative. That's what we have to do to solve the problem. So that was a good overview. Now let's get into more like what is it that has to shift in the economics of electricity to make things actually work in real places, and how is it different from one place to another?
Yeah, that's a great question. So already the economics work for large scale renewables in many places around the world, and so it's basically you can make money by putting renewables in. But so that is, we're getting there for that. That's really good. We can talk a bit about like the challenges with that. And one challenge is renewables don't often exist in the same places where you have lots of people, and so that can be a challenge. You then have to put in lots of big transmission wires and all that kind of stuff. That becomes expensive. Or in places like Australia, if you've got lots of renewables going in, you think about it, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. There's this intermittency problem. We as the world have not quite figured out cheap enough storage yet. So as in like batteries are getting there, but they're not cheap enough yet to balance that out. And there's lots of different technologies we can put in to make that work. But the big challenge there is we've got some good big renewables that work. Yes, economics, perfect, no problem. To deal with the places where we can't get those big renewables in, or it's inaccessible, or it's not economically advantageous because there's just not a sense of population there, we can have distributed energy resources, small scale, people's rooftops, small scale batteries, community batteries, small wind, all that kind of stuff really does work. But then we get this challenge in somewhere like Australia, where it's got the highest per capita solar on the roof. So more than per our population, we've got more solar on roofs than anywhere else in the world. But solar gets switched off often because, or is not allowed to be installed now because we've got too much and we're not using it at the right time. So we're now in this weird space where we're like, this is free energy from the sun to electricity, but you can't export it, you can't send it to your neighbor, you can't do that, all because of regulation and because of the dynamics of the way the grid works. It's a complicated sort of system. So to get around that and to make that easier, we've been, environmental commodities. So environmental attribute commodities have been created. Things like carbon offsets, carbon credits, renewable energy certificates. These they're market mechanisms, economic mechanisms that say, hey, if you've reduced your emissions over there, we'll pay for that in terms of a carbon offset, and we'll take those credits and assume that we've made that reduction. Now, there's a lot of nuance and complexity underneath that, and there's lots of challenges with it, but that's the basic premise. You can balance it out. Similarly, with renewable energy certificates, you can say, hey, we've got, if you can say I'm generating electricity at this point in time that is renewable, and I'm taking it and someone else is taking it out of the grid at that point in time, and you can link those two together, that's a genuine use of renewable energy. There are some challenges in that renewable energy certificate world when it's not specific about where it's been generated or when it's been generated and or who's used it at that point in time, whereby you're just chucking new energy on board, but it's actually not changing whether fossil fuels have been used or not because they're doing it at different times. And so there's the actual economics, and there's kind of like commodities that sit on top.
But it sounds like, okay, so I kind of want to go in two different directions, but I'm going to at least just name them and then we can choose. So it sounds like there is a specificity about the verifiability of the energy. time,
Yeah.
place, who's responsible for it, ownership, whatever it might be, right? Those sorts of things. So that's coming into the grid. And then it sounds like there's this whole other sort of, probably less of my bailiwick, but something I really want to understand more. Economics of transfer, economics of offsets, and we've all purchased, carbon offsets. We've purchased carbon offsets when we take flights, that sort of thing. But I don't think as a system, as a system that actually proves out that it does the job, people understand it. So I know we can go into like some of those details about like, well, is it real, or can you verify it, or why do we want to give it to somebody who's actually burning a carbon somewhere? Or like, I mean, because there's a little bit of like, it's coming from a bad place and it's coming from a good place, and we're trying to trade them. Don't we all just want to get to a good place? And I know I'm making it super simple, but I'm hoping in saying some of these words, it will start teasing out, because I think a lot of us don't grok it. We just don't understand, will it really work?
Yeah.
So how can you help us understand it?
You've hit the nail on the head. It is really, we've been doing carbon offsets. Let's start with carbon offsets. We've been doing that for a very long time. It's been sort of the mid 90s is when the first ones came out in the US. And so it's like, we know theoretically how it's meant to happen, yet still we're now 25, 30 years later experiencing those kind of headlines saying these carbon offsets are all a scam, because some of them have been pure scams. Like, it's just or with the best intention of the world, the people who put them together have not been able to, they can't see into the future, and so they can't guarantee whether it's going to be that additional carbon offset. So to make it easier, the offsets are, when you look at, like, goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, when there's some places where $1 or let's say $10, 10 US dollars goes a lot further to implement an energy system than it does in the US. If you go to a place where it's just cheaper to put that in, that's where carbon offsets came from. It's actually cheaper to offset it somewhere else. So surely we should spend our global climate dollars on those places to then make sure that those places are not polluting, to help them. That's why it's under the UN Climate Change Convention. It was called the Clean Development Mechanism. That's actually what I wrote my PhD on back in the day, was how do we then channel money into clean energy projects around the world. And it is a fantastic idea. It really is good. And the UN puts a bunch of rules and regulations around it, and they came up with essentially, validation of the project, methodologies that prove, yes, this is true, and the very best thing they could possibly come up with to say, this is additional. Yes, it wouldn't have happened without that money going in the first place. And loads of good projects have been created from that. And it's like, this is the thing you came back to before, is like, there's been so much progress and there's so much good stuff that's happened. We can't throw that out. And I remember talking about carbon offsets in the late 2000s. I'd be at a conference with a bunch of market, carbon offset traders who are like, oh, you're just some crazy lefty academic. And then the other end, I'd be like at an academic conference and they'd be like, you're some awful neoliberal capitalist. I'm like, it's actually neither, right? It's like, we are somewhere in the middle. And that's where we see this. And I was lucky enough to have an incredible supervisor. And when I talked to her about this, we talked about this as progressive possibilities. We're both pretty, we need to cut this stuff out and we need to make sure this is real and true. But there are some possibilities here, and so that's what we look for. So the carbon offset thing is, we can use these commodities to drive good change, and that is the bit that makes it worthwhile, I think. But it is the underlying. I wrote a paper on this in 2011, and it got published in a radical left geography journal. I was an economic geographer, and it was called The Matter of Carbon, and it was based on how do we really know we've reduced this carbon. And funnily enough, I flicked through it the other day and I sent it to David, my co-founder, and David. But I said, this is the paper. This is what we're trying to do right now. This is what we're building. And it's like, and it was for me, it was super cool, because like it basically came down to, the conclusion of the paper was, if you can get the methodology and the technology right at the core, at the base of where you're trying to create these offsets or new energy systems, and that data is true and can be validated and verified properly, then you've got real benefit. And if you can't do that, then you're just marketing hot air. And so that, for me, what we, all the stuff we did ETH Denver, I'm like, this is awesome, because this is what we actually need. And Holochain is such an incredible platform to do that on, because of the privacy, but also the ability to hold that data immutably and share it when you need to share it is so strong. And that's what we need in this space. So anyway, that was a bit of a rant, but they were...
No, but it's an important piece of it. And it gets exactly to the heart of how do you move that truthfulness, that specific integrity, essentially, across the line. It's a different form of, you were talking about moving the electricity difficulties. Well, you also have difficulties of moving that data that provides, verifiability and basically trust at the end of the day.
Trust.
In the economic side of the equation. So
that's right.
So how is this So how is this currently limited? I mean, why is it that people can't get this done right now? Or can they?
Well, I'll come to that. I just want to pick up on one thing you just said there, which is really, really interesting, is that, and we talked about this kind of like in the pre-show, which is around compliance and regulation and policy and that kind of stuff. Now, the boring stuff that sits behind this, that's driving this around, is compliance, it is transparency, it's good governance. And one of the biggest things now in the climate and energy space is companies who say, I've produced this product and down the line someone's bought it and it's a green product and it's no carbon, they can be audited, and they have to, actually now they will have to show reasonable assurance. And in the accounting world, that's financial accounting. And so they need to be able to show an audit trail of what has happened. And so imagine if you're creating a product that's a zero carbon product and it's going down the line, it gets consumed down the line by 2 or 3 customers, a distributor, then another customer who is claiming that carbon reduction. And that is called the Scope 3 emissions. And that is a really hard place to be, because the end customer can't claim it and the producer can't claim it at the same time, because you're double counting. So there needs to be this audit trail all the way through that shows what it was, how it was created, how it was transacted, who bought it, how much they've consumed, and what are they claiming. And that is the underpinnings of all these commodities. And if we can get that right, then you can show a clear, and it's provenance, but it's provenance by being able to basically click down into the original point of sale invoice. And so this exists in Web 2, but the trouble is the Web 2 work, it's easily corruptible. It's easy to, have things go missing. It's easy to have very big challenges in cybersecurity. And so that's what I think is really cool with, what we're talking about here, is this ability to do it in a Web3 sense. But the thing that's the compliance issue that's driving this now, that is global, it's real, it's coming in. The challenge in doing this in the past has been basically that when you're going to buy an offset, it's all done by PDFs and like basically writing methodology documents, making the PDF, doing some calculation in Excel, PDFing that, like submitting it to a registry. The registry, like a standards organization, goes, okay, yep, that looks good. We'll give it a stamp, and then that sits in a database on their website. And when you buy your 10 tons of carbon that you've had to go for a couple of conferences, they change the underlying database, because what they're saying is you've consumed those carbon offsets. So they take off 10 tons from their database and they give you a credit. They give you a piece of paper on a PDF in your email that says, here's your 10 tons. And so that is just rife for things going wrong. And now it's getting better and it's getting more automated, but it is still more or less, that's how it's done in the Web 2 world. And that is challenging. So there's a lot of room there for things to go wrong. No one is trying to make it go wrong. I really believe that. They're trying to do their very best, but surely there's a better way. And so what we're hearing now, and some of the customers who are coming to us are saying, okay, we love the solution that IOEN's got, we love the solution that Holochain's got, we love the fact you're putting them together, because we are very concerned about our auditability going through in the future. And we think this kind of nicely wrapped up solution with Holochain underneath it provides a great way for us to see what that data is. So it's early days, but it's finally making sense, and it's coming because compliance is making it push that way as well.
So basically, and I'm going to just throw a different word in there for some folks who are listening. I think when we talk about compliance, that is the world of legislation and policy.
Yeah.
And it's where the countries around the world in some of the international agreements that are being made are saying, yes, we agree to define things in certain ways. Yes, we agree to certain rules, and we'll all play by the same set of rules at a sort of policy side level. And then we'll also enact laws in our various jurisdictions that essentially give us the teeth behind this to ensure that the companies play the right way over time. Am I right?
That's it. That's
okay,
exactly
great.
right. Exactly right.
Okay, good.
Perfectly put.
I
Yeah,
think
exactly.
that's
Sorry,
really
compliance to the
important to
rules.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lot of negative connotation sometimes to the word compliance, as if it's a bad thing for business. And I like reminding people that these things that we sometimes push up against and complain about, they also are the tools for creating a better society. And so I want to make sure we're saying, hey, even with things like Holochain, which is about peer-to-peer technology, we work better when there are policies that enable and demand this kind of technology be implemented to do proof. And so I think that's really cool. Let's talk a little bit about the way things are measured, and let's kind of get into the details a little bit, because I think a lot of the devil's in the details, especially with energy production and energy purchase. And you were starting to get into that in terms of how they're dealing with this stuff in PDFs. But how can it be done differently if you've got transactional systems that can be transparent? And what do we need to do to make that agreeable between the parties?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Look, I think if agreeable between the parties is the key bit to start with. Like, are those parties happy to use a different system to transact? And I think the ability, to use capability tokens, the ability to have a way to say, hey, we've got two parties in different organizations. They need a way to have an interaction which they can trust, even though they might not know each other, even though they're dealing with something that is slightly remote. If they can trust the system by which they're interacting, and they can trust the data that underpins it, that gives them confidence they're buying something worthy. And we go through this psychologically, like you said, when you're going to buy an offset, when you're going to fly, like, is this a scam? Am I just buying, like, because someone literally just sends you an email saying, here are your tons of carbon. Like, what have I just bought? And so if you can actually say, and they say, hey, it's from this forestry project here, and it gives you a nice picture and a kind of blurb about it, that's cool. But I can't actually tell if that's true or not. And so I think the ways to drive this so for example, in electricity, generating a renewable energy certificate that is timestamped, so it says, okay, cool, this energy was produced at this point in time, this is how much energy was produced, we can verify and validate that it's real, it's actually on that house or it's on that factory, there's an image from space, there's an image from the ground, we've also got some geolocation, even Web3 geolocation platform layers in there. So we're talking to a number of different partners who do this, which is really cool to then say, hey, that's the geographic location. So we've got all these cross-reference data points that sound a bit like overkill, but actually are really important. And when you get this right, it's actually relatively simple, but then just says, that's true, it's real, I'm happy I bought that thing. And it's just giving trust to what that's happened. And then when we go into a transaction layer, it's really the ability to have that. It's not even mutual credit at that point. It's just an understanding. This is the correct data. And that the ownership of that data has moved from one entity to another. And eventually that data is saying, yes, we've proved this energy has been created over here, however many megawatts or however many kilowatts it is, and we've used this many kilowatts here. That's how we're connected to the source. And so creating the system of exchange is the key bit.
Right.
And
well,
sorry, and the last bit, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so but system of exchange, but also like it has to deal. We have to deal with regulators as well, and so it actually has to have that kind of loop as well that goes to the regulator and says, "Here's the system of exchange that's happened. Here's the commodity that comes out of it," and the regulator says, "Yes, cool. I believe that is true. I trust you," because they've seen the data that sits underneath it. So it's not done just in Web3. It actually does have to interact with regulation. And that's,
Well,
I
and
agree
in this
completely
case,
with you.
you're
It
not
gives us
talking
that.
about the regulators that are finance regulators. You're talking about the energy regulators, right?
That's right. Like
Right.
in Australia, the clean energy regulator or the environmental regulators. And you're absolutely right. That point around policy and law and regulation, it's all the boring stuff that we need to make society kind of function at a certain level. And we have the climate problem because we didn't regulate carbon. Because carbon was seen as a total, it doesn't matter, just pump it into the atmosphere, just like let it go. And it was an externality. And so regulation had to come in to try and make it a non-externality. And we still don't have proper regulation on it, but it's getting there. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. The thing that I was really hearing was that this is about trust in transactions, that we have to agree to how is something going to be measured, how is it going, like what constitutes validity. So
Yes.
the definitions that allow us to collect the correct data, what basically can be attested, because it sounds like not only do you want the from the source entry that's valid, but then you want attestations of yes, and there's a picture, and there's this, and there's coming from
Exactly.
kind of third parties about that time and place that kind of
Yes.
validate all together. It reminds me a little bit, and I think this will make it even more tangible for people. All the times you've seen photo journalism in social media where a picture is said, this thing's happening in the world, and it's some awful photo, right? And then you find out a day later that that photo's from 15 years ago and was taken
Yeah.
by this person, and it's been used
Yeah.
5 times to like save 3 different stories. And it's just unreal. But today, we need the same information about photography and journalism that we do
Yes.
about energy.
That's right. Exactly. Because otherwise you are literally consuming something that's false.
Correct.
And you're forming a worldview on something that's not correct. Exactly that. And I think that's where it gets exciting. So how geeky is that? This is where it gets exciting, that we've got all that data underneath it that's driving real change. I mean, it's like, yeah, anyway, but it is exciting because I've seen, firsthand experience of people in developing countries, and Latin America is where I did most of my work, experiencing like electricity for the first time because they are involved in some of these carbon commodity chains. And that is really exciting. There's also places where it's been really bad. And so how do we separate the stuff and call out the stuff that's really not working, that is that false image, call that out, exclude that from a system because it's not fair for anyone that shouldn't be happening, and prioritize those ones which are true, that the true photojournalist and the quality that sits there. And that is as you come back to your point of specificity, it's about being really specific about what that thing is. And the better we get at being specific and the systems that attest to it and validate it, the cheaper and easier it will become. And then we've actually got a real, like in the carbon sense, we've got a real carbon budget we can work with. It's just, if we don't have those data points to give us that, we're just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, and that we can't do.
So back to the question about challenge, because it seems like we are capable of coming up with agreements about specificity and value.
Yeah.
But we may not have done it yet. And maybe, I guess my question comes into, is that because we have regulations that are not appropriate to what the market needs to be now?
Yeah, that's a good question. The regulation has been pretty coarse. Like it's not been, the regulations there to try and pull down emissions. And I talk about just what climate emissions to start with, I guess, and electricity. The regulations there to be, first of all, electricity regulations there to make it safe and make it, accessible as much as possible. But then second, on carbon emissions, like let's pull those carbon emissions down. And there's different ways to do that. You can have emissions trading schemes and carbon tax, all that kind of stuff. But it's been pretty coarse. Like it's difficult to make regulations, especially on environmental issues. And so it's kind of like a big macro kind of, okay, just do this thing and let the market work within it. But that hasn't given us, it's given us some good innovation, but it hasn't given us systemic change for certain parts of the population. It has driven the cost of renewables down in terms of more competition to make them put them in. So that's fine. But I think the challenge that sits here with is regulation fit for purpose is that we're not communicating, because it's really complicated and pretty much quite boring. Like most people do not look at their energy bill. In developed countries don't look at their energy bill very much. People in developing countries look at their bill quite a lot more because they proportionally out of their domestic income spend more on energy. And so we live kind of in this kind of false economy where we're like, energy, it's a pain, we have to pay, it's a grudge purchase. Actually, in many parts of the world, energy is a prioritized purchase because it helps education, it helps, I've seen it helps maternal health, it helps a whole bunch of really good things. And so it's prioritized, but we don't see that story. And I think if we can use that data to tell a different story about what is happening around the world, there is a lot of cash sloshing around in crypto and in the normal world, that if we can provide those stories and provide that data in a way that is validated, true, and a simpler mechanism by which people can engage, there is going to be more opportunity to drive a different energy future for more people in the world. And so I think the regulation is just this kind of, yes, we need the regulation that governs how we can reduce our emissions, but underneath that, there's so much more we can do to make it more interesting, make it more exciting, and get more people involved. And there are some great startups doing this stuff now, but we're not kind of at the scale we need to be. And I think that's where it gets. And if you think about, by the end of this century, 1 in 3 of us will be African because of the population growth. What an incredible opportunity to work with and to build and to create new ways of doing this. And I think that's where this whole thing is, climate change thing is going to be won and lost in the major developing countries of the world.
Interesting. Well, that speaks to both challenge and opportunity, right? Because there's, are we speaking the same language if we're trying to solve it from not being in those places? Because I'm living in one of the developed countries of the world. And that doesn't mean I know how to deal with the problems in other places effectively.
That's right.
Which I want to ask, just kind of, I know we're finishing up here, but I want to kind of tie this back to what you're doing in ION and some of the things you were saying at the very beginning about like it being less expensive actually to solve the problem in some of these places in the world that need it the most. How does the work in ION make that kind of access available, or how does it open up the market in ways that make this kind of difference?
Cool. First of all, there's no way we can, as sitting here in developed countries, is just say, oh yes, we've got this one solution that can roll out and it solves it. And I think this is the beauty of Holochain and I'm built on top of it, is that it's specific to those places, right? How do those communities evolve? How do they organically grow and connect with each other and set those in different ways? So that's really where it gets exciting. I think so what we are doing in ION is we have this kind of vision for pure agent-based, machine-led peer-to-peer energy trading, and that would be fantastic. I think that we will absolutely get there, because that is the best way to balance the grid. And we wrote our white paper and we did all that stuff for that, but very few organizations and places are really ready for that. It's just to shift an entire energy system that's 150, 200 years old into that is pretty tough. It will get there, but it's an education piece. And so we've paired it right back to be this kind of, what's the simplest version that we can make the most impact in? And it is bringing through the data that validates clean energy has been produced at a certain point in time, at a certain way, the differentiator, storing that in Holochain, creating privacy, creating private networks, enabling certain regulators to be able to see that when they need to see it, and otherwise keeping that sovereignty of that data for the people who are generating that electricity, so they own that data and can make sure that they're getting the full value of that. And then placing that into our tokenized system in ION that enables people to either sell those into a market or other people to pre-invest in those specific generators. And so generators as in solar plants or whatever you might have there. And so our, still nascent, right? But the people we're working with, the customers that we have, are putting hardware on people's roofs and putting batteries in, and they are the ones, they're putting the hardware in. We're just helping provide that layer on top that gives that data in, store it in Holochain, and then sell it and transact the tokens that sit on top of it. I think the opportunity there is then, and we're still working through this because it's always a work in process. But the deep in narrative here, which is very useful, is this decentralized physical infrastructure networks. We can use the tokenomics to drive incentives for people to attest that something has happened, but also to drive implementation and putting in these kind of assets there. I mean, like solar and batteries. And so our job right now is to go out there and find the customers who want to drive a new economics that sits on top of their hardware. And our job is to go out there and say, this is what ION can provide in a very simple, lightweight way that you can create commodities on top of what you're doing. That's like stage one. Stage two is that agents are embedded in the hardware. Brilliant. Then they're actually talking to each other direct from source. And stage three is we're embedding that across the economy or in certain communities so they can start the peer-to-peer trading. That might not be for a little while. We've got to do these first stages, number 1 and 2, before we can even get there. And so for organizations who are in developing countries or in any country who are saying, well, actually, we want to produce more energy, we want to invest in more solar, we have some barriers to do that, either financial barriers or access to more liquidity and markets barriers, then we can help them get that. And the kind of 3 words that we always talk through is transparency. So is the data, can we see the data? Is that available to be seen through the ION Holochain system? Integrity, is the carbon commodity or the renewable energy certificate, does it have integrity? Is it real? Does it make sense because of the data? And the final one is liquidity. So transparency, integrity, and liquidity. And liquidity is there are pools of cash out there. We can help access that and provide that into these systems. And that's the key bit that's going to drive this initial adoption.
That's fabulous.
So that's what we're doing at ION. And it's what we did in East Denver with the cool bikes. And it was just, it made sense, right? It just said, right. Yes, okay. People kind of got it. So we're very grateful to you guys for pulling the bikes in because it made such a difference.
Fabulous. And it is real. That's what I like to do and talking to people about it. But what you did here at the end was kind of circle it back up, because what we weren't able to do at East Denver was show the accounting side of it, the financial side of it, the incentive side of it. And all of these things that we're talking about when we're talking about energy live in systems that are economic systems, not just systems of physical capture and use. And that's very simplistic. And so you have to sort of look at both sides of the coin, essentially, of this, the financial side and the actual energy production and distribution and use side of it, because those hold it in a way we know we can make a difference. Because like you said, if somebody can't get the investment to put in the infrastructure that creates the renewable energy in the first place, we don't start the cycle. We don't start the regenerative cycle. Right. So I love that ION is really kind of not just focused on the energy production, even though that's critical and the verifiable data is critical, but really focused on how do you make sure that people can adopt it, will adopt it, and how you can create communities generating and regenerating energy.
That's right. Exactly. Said perfectly. And that regeneration component is that the energy sits underneath the community, and then that gives the community the opportunity to generate its own income, to generate its own resources going forward. And that's where we start to see this incredible, it goes back to the very beginning, this ecology of energy. We've talked about this since the very beginning. The ecology of energy is the thing that drives this, and that will give that that has to be the outcome we get at the end of this, which is not monopolization of energy by large corporates in the middle. It's actually a full interwoven web of energy providers and consumers dealing with each other in transparent ways that they are all, as you said, they agree to. And I think if we can get there, we've got an incredible system that is genuinely empowering for people around the world.
Time to pull up our sleeves and get to work.
Oof, got a lot of work to do, but it's a good mission to be on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for being in a Holochain chat today.
Been super. And, thanks, Mary. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.